Hi everyone, thank you for joining us on this first panel of the day for me. We will be four on this panel, the three other one will be online, and the moderator will be Ben Marcoux. And Ben, I'll let you the microphone.
Thank you, Christophe. I just want to make sure we've got the title slide on the screen.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thanks. Risk and potential of opening distribution line capacity to accelerate transportation electrification in Canada. That's kind of a mouthful title, but it actually does summarize a major issue with the infrastructure of the deployment of the EV charging infrastructure. For people who are operating charging stations, who are owning charging stations, being able to deploy them where they want is a major challenge, largely because nobody knows whether the high capacity fast charging sites can actually have the power needed for their purpose. The distribution line capacity is often constrained. And what happens is that proponents will basically develop a site, they'll reach an agreement with an operator, with a site owner, and then they call the utility and say, well, we want to install a station on the corner of this avenue in that street. And then the utility says, fantastic. However, we do have this little problem of grid constraint, and we'll get back to you in 3 years. The idea is that opening the distribution line capacity data has great risk, great potential for proponents of EV charging stations, but it also comes with risks. Among other things, like there's some cybersecurity risk that can be raised with this. And the idea is to debate here what's needed and what can utility do about this. We are fortunate today to look at this problem from 3 different perspectives, and amazingly 3 non-competitive perspectives at the moment. Christophe, you can move forward. I think it's probably better. Yeah, so that's me. I've been in this industry for a while, and especially recently as an advisor to ChargeHub, which is an application used by EV drivers. I've written a number of reports on the EV charging infrastructure, and you can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm kind of easy to find. Our next speaker is Scott Sharabura. Now, he represents Parkland. Parkland is a large gas station operator, Onderon, for example. That's Parkland. And so he represents the perspective of an owner, an operator of charging stations. So they're the one being surprised sometimes by the delay imposed by utilities. Next one. Rasmus comes at this from a different perspective. He says, okay, well, there's a problem with utilities. The operators complain about it, but maybe there's a workaround. So Rasmus Dilling-Hansen is marketing only at Jule. Jule makes EV charging stations, but they have built-in batteries, meaning that it's possible to install these without drawing as much power from the line at peak time as would otherwise be needed. And the third perspective, last but not the least, Christophe Delanger, who represents all of us on site. is with Hydro-Québec, and is an agent of change within Hydro-Québec, trying to unleash the data for their customer. And that's interesting. Scott is mostly out west. That's where they have deployed the charging station. Rasmus is in Toronto, and Christophe is in Montreal. So funny enough, none of these organizations is a customer of one another. So hopefully this means that they'll actually be able to speak out without concern about customers or supplier. So we'll go forward with starting with Christophe. So Christophe will speak for a few minutes, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. Christophe,
Thank you, Ben.
your turn.
So, hi everyone again. Just to let you, to give you some more information about Hydro-Québec. Hydro-Québec is a generator, transmitter, and distributor of electricity in the northeastern North America. It's wholly owned by the government of Quebec, and it's the North America's leading provider of clean energy. We have an action plan to reduce GHG, meet expected growth in electricity demand, and offer customer a reliable, simple, and affordable services. And 5 priorities that you can read here to achieve them. To do so, we'll need to add 8 to 9 gigawatt of new capacity in less than 12 years. It's titanic. This transformation will require a complex and coordinated implementation involving all stakeholders to achieve these ambitious and necessary objectives. We won't be able to accelerate the decarbonization of buildings and transportation unless there is data sharing between the main players on the municipal field. We can properly plan the decarbonization of buildings and the electrification of transportation without knowing the capacity of the electricity network to accommodate these new loads. And we can properly plan the upgrading of the electricity network without knowing the territorial development plans and decarbonization projects program and incentives for buildings, transport, and industry on the municipal territory. Some challenges of better integrated energy planning are mainly about security concern. So by opening and sharing details about the electricity capacity or the electricity grid, we open or expose vulnerabilities to security threats. Malicious actors may exploit this. And on the other side, public perception and trust by exposing those vulnerabilities, it may also raise concerns about the security and reliability of the electrical grid. Now, Scott.
Hold on. I just want to wrap up a little bit here. I'd like to highlight 2 things. First, the plan that Christophe talked about was an eye-opening event for a lot of utilities across Canada. It's the first comprehensive plan that was published by a large Canadian utility. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to be deployed. The second aspect on the security concerns and public perception, we sometimes think that utilities are overdoing it, but let's not forget that this is a essential public service. It's a life or death issue for many people. So they obviously, all utilities take this very, very seriously. At the same time, people like Scott are having some real challenges to deploy. So Scott, your turn.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Benoit. Hi to everybody. So as Benoit mentioned, my name is Scott Charabura. I'm the Vice President of EV Charging for Parkland. Not everybody is familiar with Parkland, but I guarantee you're familiar with a bunch of our brands that you'll see out on the streets of Canada. So we are one of the nation's largest networks of gas stations and convenience stores. So those of you who are in BC, you will almost certainly see Chevron gas stations in Vancouver and Victoria and all throughout the province. That's actually us. Those of you from out east, you would see Ultramar in Quebec and Atlantic Canada. In Ontario, you would see Pioneer. Those are also our brands. We have Fast Gas throughout the prairies. So we do have across our network between us and our dealers, we have about 2,000 or 2,100 gas stations stretching across every province and all the way up to the territories. So we're present in a lot of communities everywhere. We've been serving drivers for decades. We were founded in the 70s, so more than 50 years. We've been serving the needs of travelers. And guess what? That for a long time, that's been fuel. Now that's transitioning to electric. So that's a little bit of the challenge that we're facing. And the role that I have is to help make sure that we're making our sites ready for the electric transition. So what we've done so far is because we have such a strong position in the province of British Columbia, we actually used BC as our test bed. And so we have taken a bunch of our sites throughout the province and put EV charging facilities at them. So you would recognize this as the on-the-run charging network for those of you who are in BC. As Benoit mentioned, it is only in BC and a little bit in Alberta right now. But as of last Friday, we opened our 39th fast charging site in beautiful Salmon Arm, British Columbia, and we will be at 50 by the end of this year. We have a bunch more that are opening in late November and in December. Some of you who would have seen our announcement, we actually did sign an announcement last week for a major funding deal with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. This has given Parkland access to up to $210 million to be expanding our EV charging network, not just in Western Canada, but essentially across the country, and with a big focus in particular on Quebec, where we do see a huge amount of EV adoption, as well as Ontario. So that's going to be quite a challenge for us to be deploying that money over the course of the next 4 years. What you'll see, I mean, we've tried to be quite innovative with some of our site designs. So you'll see on the page, we did open, most of our sites would have the ability to charge 4 vehicles at the same time. We did open a site in Hope, which for those of you not familiar, this is on the Trans-Canada, about an hour and a half east of Vancouver. So if you're going up to the cottage from Vancouver, chances are you're stopping in Hope. And we built a charging station there that has the ability to fast charge 12 vehicles simultaneously, which other than what Tesla has done across the country, this is the largest fast charging site anywhere in Canada. We're going to continue to push the boundaries of what consumers are looking for. I do think there is a trend to be putting larger charging stations in place, which raises the bar in terms of electrical demand and does kind of tee up, raise some of the questions that Christophe talked about in his opening around power availability at different sites. So could you flip to the next page, Christophe? So if you put yourself in my shoes, so I mentioned we have 2,100 retail sites that are across the country between us and our dealers. In theory, any one of them could be a candidate for EV charging, but we have to figure out which ones to prioritize. And one of the things that we've discovered is that some are good and some are not so good. Part of this is consumer based. So you'll see at the bottom of the page here, we do take a look at site amenities. We want to make sure that there's a bathroom. We want to make sure that there's a good convenience store, ideally that there's food, that these are sites that are close to the highway. We have a bunch of space constraints. So some of our sites are big, some are quite small. And so you can't always fit charging at a site that wasn't designed to accommodate it. And permitting can be an issue. But there are 2 issues that you'll see where there are significant open data implications, right? Traffic count is one, and this is something that even just for our fuel network, we are regularly looking at open data around traffic count How much is going through? Is it seasonal? Is it heavy duty versus light duty vehicles? These are all actually very important for us as we're building out infrastructure, and they have been for years. And I describe that as a very, very good example of open data and how it can help companies like us build infrastructure for the future. Electrical capacity is the other one, and this is new for us because we're coming from a fuel background and evolving into EV charging. Understanding how much power is available, understanding how quickly we can expand power. These are big deals. We've had some sites that have taken as little as 10 weeks to get up and running. That's our current record. And we've had some sites that have taken as long as 18 months to get up and running. So there's a huge difference. And a lot of that traces back to what's the availability of electrical capacity at any given location. Christophe talked a little bit about the long-term projections for Hydro-Québec at a macro level. And I think this is something that what I'd like to add to the conversation is that for us, our network of sites is 2,100 little independent businesses that all have very local traffic patterns and very local customer patterns and very localized electrical capacity, right? Every one of them is a little bit different. And so as we're putting charging infrastructure into place, we're doing what we can, but it does result in a lot of these kind of very, very micro local decisions and analyses where more data would be incredibly helpful to be able to have. And so, Ben, I'll wrap up there. I'm happy to dive into conversation and take questions, but hopefully that's a good overview for folks.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm sure that you've learned that dealing with all of the various utilities across Canada is a challenge. They're all different. They all have slightly different processes. And for people to know, I counted and actually had to count them, 145 local distribution utilities in Canada. So that's 145 different processes to get an electrical connection. So it takes a lot of patience for proponents to go through that. So it's not a single utility that is a problem. So Rasmus, that's your turn. So you think that you can fix all of this? So please tell us.
We very much hope so, at least. So I wanted to take a slightly different approach today to try to properly introduce how we think we can solve this from our perspective, is to give everybody a little bit of an overview as to how the current modern grid is set up and how electricity travels to our homes. As Benoit was saying before the conference, that most people tend to think that electricity comes out of the plug in the wall, when in reality, you know, it starts up the chain in a much more complex way. So this will be redundant for some people that'll be very familiar with this, much more than myself, but I think it'll be a good introduction into the solution and the problem in general. So we kind of look at electricity distribution in three phases, or just power generation in three phases. It starts at the generation phase, the power generation phase, which that could be your nuclear power plant, that could be solar, wind, hydro. So for BC, for example, the majority of it is generated through hydro. I believe it's the same for Quebec. So that'll change from province to province, obviously, and from state to state. And then from there, once the power is generated, it needs to be distributed. Now, the one thing to note that is very important in this scenario is that all the electricity, all the energy that is generated must be consumed. And that's how the grid was designed, however long ago that it was designed. It was designed with that in mind. It was designed with the fact that power cannot be stored. It must be consumed once it's generated. So everything on today's grid was set up in that fashion. You generate the power, then you have to distribute it from the power plant to people's homes. And that's where you will see these big transmission lines and these smaller ones within people's neighborhoods. And then that's where we get to the consumption portion, right? And that's kind of where the problem starts, is because when the grid was designed, when all that infrastructure was built, it was not built with electrification in mind. And it was built for totally different consumption predictions, right, that we have today. And that's where the problem starts, because when we look at a single level 3 charging stations, that's roughly 150 kilowatts. That's the equivalent to 125 residential homes in terms of power. So a single station is the equivalent to an entire, medium to large size neighborhood. And the current way that utilities are looking to address this problem is with a Band-Aid solution, which is upgrading the distribution lines, because, you know, the power generation, more or less, it's debatable. I'm sure people have opinions, but in most cases, for now, we can manage to generate the power that we need. But the real problem is being able to distribute that quantity at the consumption level that's required. And that's where utilities have to come in to upgrade the transmission lines. So if you look outside your window and you see those, you know, transmission lines on your block, they will have big buckets on them. Those are called transformers. And that's what enables utilities to distribute on a much simplified level the amount of electricity that's needed for level 3 EV charging. So they need to add more transformers to that bucket line. And it's a big strain on the utilities, and there's a lot of costs, right? So there's permitting involved. You need to order the transformers, which, you know, are kind of constrained at the moment. We estimate for an individual site that upgrade on its own, it can take about 12 months. And the upgrade cost in itself, which the site host ends up paying the majority of the time, is between $300,000 to $1.2 million if we're looking at 4 EV charging stations. That number to a lot of people can seem quite bloated, but I can assure you that anybody that works in the industry that has dealt with these projects will tell you that that's not a bloated number. It's actually quite reasonable in terms of the range that is being quoted. So we can get to the next slide now. And that's kind of where we come in and we kind of look at the solution in a different lens. And we look at it from a storage perspective. So what we do is we manufacture and we deploy energy storage systems. And our storage systems are they're basically mini urban microgrids. And what they enable us to do is they enable us to take whatever the power capacity at a given site that is existing is. So whatever the leftover capacity behind the meter at a given site is, we store that into our energy storage system. And you can think about this like a water tank. You just fill up the water tank with whatever the amount of water that you have coming out of your faucet. And then once the water tank is full of electricity, then we can discharge it at the power requirement that is needed. So that essentially does two things. It stores energy. So, you know, essentially that whole mentality that we have to consume everything that we generate, we don't think about it in that way because we're able to store that power at a later use. But also, more importantly, for the case of EV charging, it enables us to amplify power. And that's really the crucial and important aspect, because we're taking a 50 kilowatt feed and we're able to output 600 kilowatts of power. So if the average level 3 EV charging station is 150 kilowatts, we can do 4 chargers out of 1 battery without any utility upgrades, right? In a lot of cases, because if your site has spare 50 kilowatts, which a lot of sites do, or even less, we take that and then we can output 600 from there. At the same time, we're able to provide a lot more ancillary services. Like if your site has solar, we can store the power from solar, which means we can take even less power from the grid directly. We can push energy back into the facility itself instead of the chargers. To do power backup, demand response. If you want to push the electricity back onto the grid directly, we can peak shave. We can do energy arbitrage with the battery. So it's really like a versatile and dynamic tool that enables us to essentially electrify and just provide overall more resiliency. So now, hopefully, you can start to understand why this is such an important topic of conversation for us. Christophe, you can go. Yeah. Because essentially our model and our company and our technology, it exists essentially just to solve this problem that we're talking about today. It's to alleviate the grid capacity and resiliency problem. That's why we exist at Jule. And as you can imagine, for us, the most important thing to understand when we're looking for sites to electrify or when we're talking to potential customers is to understand, okay, what is your grid capacity problem at your sites that you're trying to put level 3 charging stations at? Because that is where our value is going to come in primarily, because we're going to, in a lot of cases, bypass the utilities completely And in most cases, we'll still need utility involvement, but it just would not be to the scale that is required in a traditional direct-to-grid capacity, where they would need to pull, all 600 kilowatts at the site to add the chargers. We might need to pull, only 50 or 100 kilowatts. So the number one big thing is better site planning and acquisition, obviously. If you can just only imagine, if we could look at the potential data that is available in terms of how the transmission lines are doing and how the distribution grid is doing, we'd be able to isolate all of the sites that are grid starved, as we call it, which have very little to low power capacity. We could overlay that with the potential traffic flow data that Scott was talking about. And we have our most important sites in Canada that need to electrify and that at the same time do not have the capacity for it, right? And that's where we'd be able to come in, to essentially solve the problem at a much more efficient level. The other way that we kind of look at it from a perspective from the utilities is this would enable us to really stop the bleeding. And what do I mean by that? Right now, the situation is quite dire, I think, as most people are aware. And I can imagine that it's very dire on the utility level, right? So this would enable us to work closely, more hand in hand with utilities, to really be able to see and say, okay, these are your sites that are the most problematic at the moment. We can address those while giving you and buying you time to modernize the grid as you need, or to fix other issues that are required. Yes, Benoit, I see that you've raised your hand.
Well, I kind of have to stop you because we need to get to the question period.
Yes.
Can we, Christophe, can we move to the next slide? Last slide, really? Great. So Christophe and I had a bit of fun, and we asked, who else? ChatGPT, about the top risk and potentials of opening this distribution line capacity data. So that's what came out of it. It's actually not bad, probably enough to get the discussion going. So cybersecurities, obviously, for example, pirates could target stations that are overloaded because it'd be easier to topple them. The potential for market manipulations in some places, privacy and regulatory concerns. Utilities can't, divulge customer information, and some of it could be inferred from line and station capacity data. Potential is we could possibly make the grid more reliable and efficient, certainly efficient, by locating stations where they can easily be located. Easier integration of renewable energy, because these lines can also support like small solar or wind installations. Market efficiency and competition, because you can actually get more people on the grid. So do we have any question from the audience? Christophe?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
For Hydro-Québec, you have Parkland and Jule asking for access to line capacity and usage data. Is there a plan to make that data available?
Christophe, you
It's
better
not directly
repeat.
Parkland and Jule that they are asking for more open data. It's like what we want to expose here is there's a need to have access to more open data on the electrical distribution capacity data for those use cases. So on a municipal field, we have to make this data more freely available, more open, that companies like Parkland or Jule can better integrate their services or products to facilitate the decarbonation of the transportation or buildings, to accelerate the energy transition and reduce GHG emissions. We plan we plan to open more data in this way.
Scott and Rasmus, any comment?
Yeah, so I think it's great to hear that the direction is headed toward more openness. I think that will help companies like ours to be able to do planning more effectively. The one thing that I would maybe insert into the conversation is that it's hard to underestimate just how much activity is happening around this right now. I mean, everybody's seen what's happened around EV adoption, particularly in BC and Quebec, but I'd argue just about everywhere in the country. I mean, it's going like that, right? And so, you know, charging infrastructure is perpetually behind where EV adoption is like. So many companies are in this boat, right? So I'd say that like the challenge is only becoming more and more painful, and especially as we start to exhaust the places that are easy to do from an electrical capacity perspective, we're going to start to get into areas that are harder and harder, right? So I'd argue the challenge is just going to be getting harder and harder.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would echo that, and I would just say that for us, the way that we look at it is just that, and obviously when we get into the risks and the counter arguments to that, there's going to be different perspectives. But generally speaking, transparency is typically leads to more market efficiency. At least that's the way that we look at it here. And you know, more competition and more transparency just leads to being able to electrify in a much more pressing way and more efficient way without, you know, avoiding to do band-aid solutions as we've been doing up to this point with a lot of the cases. So, yeah.
Thank you. Question? Okay, I just need to repeat for everyone. So the question was, who leads who has the jurisdictions to impose the openness of more data in this kind of electrical capacity data? By now, as I know, there's some jurisdiction, I think, in Europe. Frank, you may correct me if I'm wrong, that it's mandatory to open some kind of data. Here in Canada, as I know, there's no obligation to do so. But what I see is all the governments and the Canadian government are spraying a lot of money and just pray that solution will come. So we will tend to help this, putting the money at the right place to accelerate the electrification of buildings and transportation and industries. This is the main objective of opening more data. At Hydro-Québec, we want to just facilitate all the other electricity industries or energy provider to do so. There's many ways to open data without with limiting risk and that can be benefits, that potential benefits will be for all participants of the ecosystem, energy ecosystem.
If I may, Christophe, some examples of some data opening. There's in Ontario for distributed energy resources. We're talking solar panels on roof and these sort of things. There is a database available that was required to be put in place by the local electricity regulator, the Ontario Energy Board. That's called the State Line and Station Capacity. and each of the 65 or so distributor in Ontario has its own page that says, on these lines, this is the capacity to install distributed generation. But that's probably the best example I can think of in Canada. Scott or Rasmus, if you have other example, I'd like to hear about that. And individual utilities may be more open than others. Also, among the 145 of these, some are more open than others.
Yeah.
So Scott and Rasmus.
Yeah, I think, Ben, the one thing I would add is that for some, in some cases, this may end up being an issue of economic competitiveness, right? So again, companies like us, we operate coast to coast, and we're looking for places to be putting EV charging infrastructure. Where demand is part of it, right? But also where is it easy to build is part of it. And we've seen this, not related to electrical capacity, but related to permitting, local permitting. If I take a look across Metro Vancouver, we have sites in a lot of different communities in Metro Vancouver. I can tell you, some of the local permitting jurisdictions are easier to deal with than others. And so guess which areas got chargers first from us, right? It was the areas that were easier to deal with. And so I could see that potentially being an issue, that jurisdictions that aren't open and jurisdictions that, utilities that aren't working closely with companies like ours and having an easy way to engage, it's going to be harder for us to invest, right? Not because we don't want to, but just because, realistically, we have if it's easier for us to build down the road in the next jurisdiction, yeah, we'll probably do that.
Huh. Thanks. I didn't thought of that, but absolutely right. Cities, towns where it's easy to build, that's where you're going to build first, not the next town over where it's hard.
And it's about it's less of an issue in provinces that have one large utility. So in Quebec, for instance, everything goes through Hydro-Québec. So that's not the situation. But in Ontario, there's a lot of small local utilities, right?
Municipal utilities too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we see that problem, especially on a much on a very large scale, because a big part of our customer base is in the US, even though we're a Canadian company.
Yeah.
And dealing with every state is a completely different ballgame. It's countries within countries. It's very different. So the consistency of it is very critical, and it's very difficult too, because it strains a lot of our resources internally, because we need analysts and experts to deal with every single locality, which is really a nightmare for any firm, especially small ones, for small businesses. So that's where I think Europe has a big advantage, if they're able to dictate those kind of laws and transparency acts, at a large scale.
Yeah, there are 145 distribution utilities in Canada, but about 3,000 in the US. So, yep.
Ben, we have many other questions here and only 5 minutes remaining, so I will be going for, I think the yes, you.
So we try to get this data, and I should probably speak to a few of you. We eventually gave up because it was just a bit of a difference across the whole country in terms of what kind of this data was available. But I'll reach out to you on LinkedIn about that. But my question actually is a more problematic one, and that is whether this should be a regulated. You're assuming that this is like fuel. You can have competitive gas stations, and I'm not convinced. You can convince me, try to convince me. I'm not unconvinced. But should this be like distribution, in which there is only one distributor, there is only one provider of charging stations, and they are regulated by the Energy Board? And I think this is a discussion we need to have in Canada, because it sounds to me like this is going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies across the board. So that's my statement. I don't know if it's a question at this point, but listening to this, I'm not convinced that this is a competitive market at the end of the day.
Do you want to go, Ben, or I jump in?
You're on mute, Ben.
I missed the first part of the question, and I think the same thing for the others. I'm not sure what market the question refers to.
Well, right now you have all parties are coming forward and trying to set up charging stations, and I'm saying there should be one entity setting up charging stations on the distribution system in the optimal locations. It's not competitive. You regulate it, just like you regulate distribution.
Right now, the market for a charging station is actually quite competitive. They're like 20 some charging operators in Canada of some size. So there's a lot of people putting in charging stations, high speed, low speed, gas station or along streets. There's a lot of them coming online. I would also add that the penetration of EV is, even in Quebec and BC, is something like 3%, 4% of actual cars on the road. So whatever we've got, we need to multiply by what, 20? So there's even if someone builds it at the not quite the ideal place, chances are that in a few years that place will be needed anyway.
I think, Ben, the question was around that there should only be one single charging network that's electrifying, all of Canada for simplicity's sake. I think, advocating for kind of a monopoly market is never good for the end user and the consumer, as we've learned many times around through history. Also, I think what we're dealing with right now, it's a very modern day problem, but it's not new, if that makes sense. We dealt with this with combustion engine vehicles when we had to, install gas stations across all of the Americas as well. And we don't have, a monopoly market when it comes to gas stations and having gas stations around the country. So I think if we kind of, I like to look at the industries in a very similar way. We're kind of the new gas stations of the future. And in a model like that, I do agree that having too much competition can be difficult for early entrants of EVs, but in the long run, I don't think it's going to benefit the consumer.
Fuel is not electricity. They are not the same things. They are very different from each other.
Maybe one last question. So what would be the nature of the data that you need, actually? Because, for example, in France with RTE, Réseau de Transport Électrique, they provide... I think it's better without the micro.
I will take this one, and you can jump in after me. As I know the issue, and it will a little bit more related to the previous question, it's we have to take gas, fuel, and carbonize energy sources, loads, and put them on the electricity grid. So we have to be able to know the limits, the limits in terms of capacity and powers that they are available in the actual grid, and what it is planned to receive this load by decarbonization of buildings, transportation, and industries. So the data that it is needed at our level is just to be able to answer with this EV charger or this municipal decarbonization in buildings plan or program. If I put this in place, does the electricity grid have the capacity to handle this now or in the near future? If it can't, we have to work together with the utility to know when it will be available, and to adjust the program or the planned work to install an EV in consequences. Ben, we have to wrap up. It's the end of the my first panel today. It's quite interesting, and thank you everyone. And I let you the final words, Ben. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. And we're just at the beginning of the transition to EVs. I'm an EV driver. It'd be nice. How many people are EV drivers in the room? As a percentage?
4.
Okay. So I'll leave you to that. I really encourage you to buy an EV. It's the future of individual transportation. And then you'll understand maybe a little more of the concerns of both all AV drivers and people building the public charging infrastructure. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to all. Thanks to you both.
Thank you, Benoit. Thanks,
Thank
Scott.
you,
Nice
Benoit.
meeting you.
Good to meet you. Bye.